The pale hand appeared first, long fingers curling around the garden gate at the precise moment Elara Vance drove her spade into the earth. She was 22 years old, though her soul felt ancient. She did not look up. The rhythmic work of turning soil had become her meditation, her silence a fortress she'd spent lifetimes building. The cottage garden sprawled around her in twilight's purple glow, roses climbing the stone walls like patient soldiers. Eleanor. The name hung in the air between them. Wrong, but not entirely. She'd been Eleanor once, in another century, in another life. Now she was Elara. The distinction mattered. She pressed her boot against the spade and drove it deeper. "I know you hear me." Of course she heard him. Lord Alistair Blackwood's voice carried the same aristocratic precision it had possessed 300 years ago. Every syllable perfectly formed. Every word a small cruelty of remembrance. Elara lifted a clump of dark earth and shook it loose from the roots of a stubborn weed. Her hands, she noted with satisfaction, did not tremble. She had trained them well during her exile from speech. "You cannot ignore me forever." She could. She had. And she would continue to do so. The gate hinges creaked. He was entering her sanctuary now, uninvited. She heard his footsteps on the stone path, measured, unhurried. The sound of a man who had all the time in the world because time could not touch him. Elara straightened slowly, brushing soil from her simple work dress of faded blue cotton. She turned. There he stood, as impossible as ever. Tall and imposing in his severe black coat, his jet black hair swept back from that pale, aristocratic face. But it was his eyes that struck her, those ancient, piercing silver eyes that had not aged a single day since their argument in 1723. She had aged, died, been reborn, lived entire lives, loved others, buried them, grieved, and started again. The cycle had repeated itself 4 times now, each incarnation carrying the memory of the last, like stones in her pockets. He had simply waited. 3 centuries, Alistair said softly. 300 years of silence, Eleanor. Surely that is punishment enough. Elara met his gaze with her storm-grey eyes and said nothing. Her silence was not punishment. It was protection. It was the only weapon she possessed against an immortal who could outlast any argument, any anger, any declaration of independence. He had called her clingy once. The word had landed like a blade between her ribs. She had been young then, truly young, not this borrowed youth, and foolish enough to believe that loving him completely was a virtue rather than a burden. She would never give him another word to use against her. "I have come to apologize," he continued, taking a step closer. "I have rehearsed it 10,000 times. I have written it in every language I know. I have—" Elara turned back to her garden. She knelt and resumed her work, her hands steady as she loosened the soil around a rosebush. The thorns caught at her sleeves, drew thin lines of red across her wrists. She welcomed the sting. "Please." His voice cracked on the word. "Please, just one word, any word. Tell me to leave. Tell me you hate me. Tell me—" She pulled the weed free and tossed it onto her growing pile of discards. Behind her, she heard him sink to his knees on the path. The great Lord Blackwood, brought low by silence. Part of her. The part that still remembered being Eleanor, being clingy, being dismissed, felt a savage satisfaction. But the larger part, the part she had carefully cultivated through centuries of solitude, felt only the quiet determination to protect what she had built. This cottage, this garden, this peace. He could not take it from her if she gave him nothing to grasp. "I will return tomorrow," Alistair said finally, his voice hollow. "And the day after. And the day after that. I have time, Eleanor. I have nothing but time." Elara's hands tightened on the spade. There it was, the threat wrapped in devotion, the promise that her hard-won peace would never truly be hers again. She heard him rise, heard his footsteps retreat, heard the gate close with a soft click. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. The cottage door closed with a firm click. Elara leaned against it, her soil-stained hands pressed flat against the weathered wood. He was still out there. She could feel his presence like a cold draft under the door. 300 years, 4 lifetimes, and he had finally come. She pushed away from the door and walked through the narrow hallway. Her boots left faint dirt prints on the floorboards. The study waited at the end of the corridor, its door already ajar. This room was hers alone. Mrs. Agnes Poole cleaned it weekly, but touched nothing on the desk. The housekeeper understood that some spaces were sacred. Elara crossed to the mahogany writing desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside lay 4 leather journals, their spines worn soft with age and handling. She lifted them out carefully, reverently, and set them on the desk in a neat row. First life, second life, third life, fourth life. Her hands, still trembling slightly, reached for the oldest journal. The leather was cracked and brittle. She had to be gentle when she opened it, or the binding would crack further. The pages inside were yellowed. The ink faded to brown. But the words remained clear enough. He called me clingy today. Her first entry, written in the careful script of a young woman who believed words on paper, made pain more manageable. I loved him with everything I had. I thought immortals understood devotion. I thought my constancy would please him. Instead, he looked at me with those silver eyes, those beautiful, terrible eyes, and said, I suffocated him. Elara's storm-grey eyes traced the familiar lines. She had read these words hundreds of times, maybe thousands. They never changed, and neither did the ache they produced. She turned the page. I will never speak to him again. This I vow. Not in this life, not in any life that follows. He wants space. I will give him an eternity of it. The vow, made in grief and rage and devastating hurt. She had kept it through death and rebirth, through 4 separate childhoods where she remembered everything but had to wait until she was old enough to act, through chance encounters in crowded market squares and formal ballrooms where he would appear, always watching, always waiting. He never approached, not until today. Elara closed the first journal and opened the second. This one documented her second life, a merchant's daughter in a coastal town. She had seen him only twice that lifetime, once at a harbour festival, once outside a church. Both times, he had simply stood there, watching, his face carved from marble, his silver eyes full of something that might have been regret. She had walked past him as if he were air. The third journal was thicker. She had lived longer that time, seen him more often. He had started leaving letters. She burned them all unread and documented each one in careful detail. Letter 17 arrived today. I burned it in the kitchen hearth. Mrs. Agnes asked if I was well. I said yes. I lied. The 4th journal was newer, its leather still supple. This life, this version of herself, 22 years old and living in a cottage with a garden she tended like a fortress. The last entry was from 3 weeks ago. I dreamed of him again. In the dream, I spoke. I said his name. I woke up terrified that I had broken my vow in my sleep. But vows made in waking cannot be broken by dreams. I checked. I researched. I am safe. Elara set down the journal and stared at the 4 volumes lined up before her. This was why she stayed silent. Not just because of the hurt he had caused, but because breaking the vow now would mean all of it. All 4 lifetimes of discipline and pain and careful distance had been for nothing. She had built her silence into something larger than herself. It was architecture now, a monument to her will. And he thought one apology could topple it? Her jaw tightened. She reached for a fresh sheet of paper and her pen. Not to write to him, never to him, but to document this moment for whatever life came next. 5th entry, 4th life. He came to the garden today. He apologized. He thinks 300 years of waiting has earned him forgiveness. He is wrong. The pen scratched across the paper with satisfying firmness. I will not speak. I will not yield. This is who I am now, the woman who remembers everything and forgives nothing. Let him wait another 300 years. Let him wait forever. She set down the pen and flexed her fingers. They had stopped trembling. Outside, the sun was setting. Soon it would be dark. Soon he would have to leave or risk being seen by the neighbours. Elara gathered her journals and returned them to the drawer. She locked it with a small brass key she wore on a chain around her neck. Her fortress was secure, her resolve renewed. Let him come again tomorrow if he dared. Her answer would be the same. Silence. The village cafe smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, the kind of ordinary comfort that usually soothed Elara's nerves. Today it felt like a trap. She sat at her usual corner table near the window, a cup of tea cooling between her palms. Mrs. Agnes Poole had insisted she needed to leave the cottage, to stop brooding over those journals. The housekeeper had practically shooed her out the door with a broom. "You'll wear a hole in those pages, staring at them all day," Agnes had said. "Get some air, have some tea, be among the living." The irony wasn't lost on Elara. She was among the living. She'd been among the living 4 separate times now. Through the cafe window, she watched the village square of Grimsbridge. Neighbours strolled past. Shopkeepers swept their stoops. Mr. Davies argued with the butcher about the price of lamb, the same argument they'd had every Tuesday for 3 years. Normal, predictable, safe. Then she saw him. Alistair Blackwood stood across the square like a dark monument among the bustle. He wore a long black coat despite the mild weather, his pale face turned toward the cafe, toward her window. Those ancient silver eyes found hers with unsettling precision. Elara's fingers tightened around her teacup. He didn't approach. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. "More tea, dear?" The waitress appeared at her elbow, pot in hand. Elara nodded without looking away from the window. The waitress followed her gaze. "Handsome fellow, that one," she said, pouring. "Been standing there near an hour now. Looks like he's waiting for someone." Elara said nothing. She never said much in the village. People had learned to accept her quiet nature. "Bit odd, though," the waitress continued. "Just standing, not shopping or anything. You'd think he'd get bored." "He won't," Elara thought. "He's had 3 centuries of practice waiting." The waitress moved to another table. Elara sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Alistair's form. This was new. In her previous lives, he'd kept his distance. He'd watched from afar, left letters she burned, maintained the boundaries she'd demanded with her silence. Now he'd broken those boundaries, first in her garden, now here, in her village, among her neighbours, making himself visible, making himself impossible to ignore. An elderly woman stopped beside him, clearly asking for directions. Alistair bent his head courteously, gestured down the street. The woman patted his arm in thanks, smiling. Elara felt something twist in her chest. He could be charming when he chose. She'd learned that 300 years ago, when she'd been young and foolish enough to believe his attention meant something, before he'd called her clingy, before he'd turned away. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. 2 could play at this game. If he wanted to stand in the square all day, let him. She had a book in her bag, and Agnes had been right about one thing. She needed to be among people. Needed to remember she had a life here that existed independent of ancient vows and immortal regrets. Elara pulled out her book, opened it to a marked page. She would not run. She would not hide. She would sit here and read and drink her tea like any normal Tuesday, even if her hands trembled slightly turning the pages, even if she couldn't focus on a single word. An hour passed, then another. The cafe filled with the lunch crowd, then emptied again. Elara ordered soup she barely tasted. Through it all, Alistair remained in the square, a dark constant in the shifting flow of village life. People began to notice. Mrs. Henderson whispered to Mrs. Davies. The butcher's apprentice stared openly. Small villages thrived on oddity, and a gentleman standing motionless for hours qualified as spectacle. Finally, as afternoon shadows stretched long across the cobblestones, Alistair moved. He didn't cross toward the cafe. Instead, he turned and walked away, his coat billowing behind him like wings. Elara released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Well," the waitress said, clearing Elara's dishes, "that was strange. You don't suppose he was dangerous, do you?" Elara looked at her empty teacup, at the dregs swirling in the bottom. Dangerous? Yes, but not in the way the waitress meant. The most dangerous thing about Alistair Blackwood was that after 300 years of silence, part of her still wanted to know why he'd finally come back. The path to the cliff top wound through gorse and heather, steep enough to make her calves burn. Elara had left the cafe after 2 hours, slipping out the back entrance while Alistair remained in the square. She'd come here to think, to breathe air that didn't carry his presence. The sea crashed against rocks far below. Wind whipped her hair loose from its chignon, sending chestnut strands across her face. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wool was thick, but the cold still found her. I knew you would come here. His voice carried over the wind. Alara's hands clenched in the fabric of her shawl, but she didn't turn. The cliff edge was 20 feet away. Behind her, his footsteps crunched on gravel. You came here in your second life, Alistair continued. His voice was closer now. After your husband died, you stood exactly where you're standing now. She had. The memory was sharp as broken glass. She'd been 37 that life, a widow whose siblings didn't understand why their sister seemed older than her years, why she carried such ancient grief. And in your third life, you brought your apprentice here, showed her the seabirds. A pause. She had your eyes, storm grey. He had no right to those memories, no right to watch her across lifetimes like she was a play performed for his entertainment. I'm not here to torment you. His shadow fell across the grass beside her. I'm here because you need to know the truth. She turned then, breaking 300 years of carefully maintained indifference. Her storm grey eyes met his ancient silver ones. She said nothing, wouldn't give him that satisfaction. But she looked at him. That was enough. Alistair's aristocratic face showed surprise. Then something that might have been relief. He wore a different coat tonight, charcoal grey instead of black. The wind pressed it against his tall frame. There are others, he said quietly. Others like me. Not many, but enough. Elara raised an eyebrow. The gesture said, So? They've noticed you. A woman who remembers. Who comes back. His silver eyes held hers. Do you know how rare that is? How valuable? Her breath caught. She hadn't considered this. In 4 lifetimes, she'd focused only on maintaining her silence, on protecting herself from him. There's a vampire in Edinburgh who collects unusual humans, keeps them in his estate like living curiosities. Alistair's voice was flat, matter of fact. Another in Prague who binds those with special gifts to him, makes it last decades. The wind seemed colder now. Alara's fingers were numb inside her shawl. I've spent 3 centuries making sure they don't find you. He stepped closer, not threatening, almost pleading. Every time you're reborn, I track you. Watch for the moment you remember, and then I make sure every other immortal in Britain knows you're under my protection. Elara's mind raced. All those times she'd felt watched. Those moments when danger seemed to veer away at the last second. The man who'd followed her in her third life, then vanished overnight. The woman with 2 sharp teeth who'd approached her at a market in her second life, then never returned. You think I'm a monster, Alistair said softly. You're right. I was cruel, thoughtless. I called you clingy when you were simply loving. His pale face was drawn. But I'm the only monster standing between you and worse things. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to demand why he thought she needed protection, why he'd appointed himself her eternal guardian without asking. But the words wouldn't come. 300 years of silence was a wall she couldn't break, even now. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he continued. I'm asking you to let me keep you safe. Stop trying to force me away. His silver eyes searched hers. Because if I leave, others will come, and they won't spend centuries trying to earn your forgiveness. Alara's hands shook. This was manipulation. Had to be. A new tactic to break through her defenses. But his face held no triumph, only weariness. The expression of a man carrying an impossible weight for far too long. She turned back to the sea, stared at the waves battering the rocks below. Her silence stretched between them like a living thing. Finally, she raised one hand, made a single gesture. Go. Elara, she repeated the gesture, sharper, more forceful. She didn't care about other vampires, didn't care about threats she'd never seen. She only knew that 300 years ago, he'd broken something in her that never fully healed. Let the others come. At least they'd be honest about what they wanted. Alistair stood motionless for a long moment. Then she heard his footsteps retreat, heard them fade into the wind and the crash of waves. She was alone again, the way she'd chosen to be. The attic smelled of dust and old paper. Elara climbed the narrow stairs with a candle in one hand, her heart beating fast against her ribs. She had returned from the cliff top an hour ago, leaving Alistair standing alone in the moonlight without a word. His revelation had shaken something loose inside her. Other immortals, a threat she'd never known existed. 3 centuries of protection she'd mistaken for torment. But she didn't trust easily anymore, not after 300 years of silence. If Alistair truly had been protecting her, there would be evidence, and she knew exactly where to look. The attic of her cottage held more than just the belongings of this current life. Tucked beneath floorboards and hidden in false-bottomed trunks were the remnants of her previous existences, things she'd managed to preserve through careful planning before each death. Letters, trinkets, and one item she'd never had the courage to open. Elara set the candle on a dusty crate. She knelt before an old trunk in the corner, her fingers finding the hidden latch beneath the brass lock. The false bottom lifted with a soft creak. Inside lay a leather-bound diary. Not one of her own journals, but something she'd discovered in her third life, hidden in the study of the house where she'd worked as an apprentice. She'd recognized the handwriting immediately. Alistair's. She'd stolen it that night and never looked back. Through 2 more lifetimes, she'd kept it sealed, afraid of what it might contain, afraid it would hurt her all over again. Her hands trembled as she lifted it free. The leather was soft with age, the pages yellowed. She opened it slowly, tilting it toward the candlelight. The first entry was dated 1724, the year after he'd called her Clingy, the year she'd begun her vow of silence. I saw her today in the market. She looked through me as though I were glass. I deserve nothing less. She turned the page. The council has taken notice. Silas mentioned a mortal woman who remembers her deaths. He spoke of her as one might speak of a curiosity to be collected. I said nothing, but my blood ran cold. The council. Other immortals. This was dated nearly 3 centuries ago. She flipped forward, her pulse racing. I have claimed her as mine before the council. It is the only protection that will hold. They believe I keep her for my own amusement. Let them think it. Better they believe me cruel than curious. The pages blurred. Elara blinked hard, forcing herself to focus. She died today. I watched from the shadows as they buried her in the churchyard. Silas was there too, watching. He suspects. I must be more careful when she returns. Entry after entry, spanning decades, lifetimes, each one documenting his silent vigil, each one revealing the danger that had circled her like wolves while she'd lived in ignorance. I followed the Huntress tonight. She had tracked Elara to the village where she lives as a widow. I made certain the Huntress found other prey, messier than I preferred, but necessary. Elara's stomach turned. The Huntress. She'd heard whispers of that name in her second life, a vampire who collected rare mortals like trophies. The entries grew darker as the years passed. More names appeared, more threats diverted, more violence committed in her shadow. I am become a monster to protect her from monsters. The irony is not lost on me. Her hands shook so badly the pages rustled. She set the diary down, pressing her palms flat against the wooden floor. All this time, all these years, she'd thought herself alone, thought herself the wounded party nursing justified anger. But Alistair had been fighting a war she'd never seen, spending centuries keeping her safe from immortals who would have caged her, or worse. And she'd never spoken a single word to him. The last entry was dated just 3 months ago. I can bear the silence no longer. The council grows suspicious of my continued interest. They question why I do not simply claim her permanently. I must tell her the truth, though it means breaking the distance I have maintained. She deserves to know what hunts her. She deserves the choice I have stolen by keeping her ignorant. Tomorrow, I will go to her garden. Elara sat back on her heels, the candle flame wavering. Her chest felt tight, as though someone had laced her corset too snugly. Everything she'd believed for 300 years was a lie. Not his cruelty. That had been real. But everything after, every moment she'd thought herself free of him, he'd been there, watching, fighting, bleeding, for her. The silence she'd wielded as a weapon had been a shield he'd given her, and she'd never known. The ruined abbey crouched on the moors like a broken tooth against the dawn sky. Elara picked her way through the scattered stones, the diary clutched against her chest. She had sent word through Mrs. Poole. A simple message. I know the truth. Meet me where you fought the Huntress. She hadn't been certain he would understand, but as she reached the centre of the roofless nave, she saw him. Alistair stood beside a crumbling pillar, his tall frame perfectly still. He wore a dark coat that hung open over a white shirt. The rising sun cast long shadows across his pale face. His ancient silver eyes tracked her approach. You remember this place? He said quietly. I died here. Elara stopped 10 feet away. My third life. I was 28 years old. I collapsed in the village, and they said it was a sudden fever. It was poison. From the Huntress. She held up the diary. You wrote about following her here. The entry ended mid-sentence. Alistair's gaze dropped to the leather-bound book. Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or shame. I didn't know you'd taken that, he said. I stole it the week before I died. Elara's fingers pressed into the worn leather. I wanted to understand why you watched me, why you stayed close but never spoke. And now you do understand. I understand you've been protecting me. She took a step forward. Her voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. What I don't understand is why you had to be cruel to do it. The silence stretched between them. A crow called from somewhere in the ruins. The council needed to believe you meant nothing to me, Alistair said finally. If they suspected I cared, they would have taken you immediately, used you against me. So you called me clingy. The word still stung after 3 centuries. You made me feel small and foolish. Yes, you broke my heart. Yes. He moved toward her, then stopped. His hands hung at his sides. I have spent 300 years regretting those words, but I would say them again if it kept you safe. Elara felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, opening. The diary entry, she said. What happened when you found her? Alistair's expression went cold, remote, the face of a predator. I stopped her, he said simply. She had already poisoned you. There was no cure. I made certain she could never harm anyone again. The words should have frightened her. Instead, Elara felt a strange warmth spread through her limbs. You avenged me. I failed you. His voice roughened. You died because I wasn't fast enough, because I didn't realize she'd tracked you to the village. But you tried to save me. I have always tried to save you. He took another step closer. The morning light caught in his jet-black hair. Every lifetime, every death. I thought if I kept my distance, they would lose interest. But you kept returning, and they kept watching. Elara looked down at the diary in her hands. The pages were filled with his careful script. Decades of observations, quiet protection, a vigil that spanned centuries. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. In any of my lives, why let me think you were only watching to torment me? Because you were safer hating me. Alistair stood close enough now that she could see the weariness etched into his pale face. If you knew the truth, you would have sought me out. You would have tried to help, and they would have noticed. I'm not someone who needs to be managed. No. Something shifted in his ancient silver eyes. You are a woman who has survived 4 lifetimes while immortals plotted to cage you. You are stronger than any of them realize. Elara felt the weight of her 300-year vow pressing against her throat. She had sworn never to speak to him, never to acknowledge him. But that vow had been made in pain and ignorance. "The council?" she said. "Are they still a threat?" "Yes." Alistair's expression darkened. "They know you've returned. And this time, I cannot hide you by pretending indifference. I've broken that illusion by approaching you directly. So we're both in danger now." "Yes." Elara lifted her chin. Her storm grey eyes met his without flinching. "Then we face them together," she said. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him in 300 years. The words felt like breaking chains. Alistair went very still. For a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "Elara," he said softly, "I don't deserve—" "No," she interrupted. "You don't. But I'm not offering forgiveness. I'm offering alliance." His throat worked. He nodded slowly. "Tell me everything," Elara said. "No more secrets. No more protection through cruelty. If I'm going to survive this, I need the truth." "All right," Alistair's voice was rough. "But you won't like what you hear." "I haven't liked anything for 300 years. She managed a bitter smile. "I think I can handle it." The cottage sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Elara had walked home from the abbey ruins alone, refusing Alistair's offer to accompany her. Her boots waited by the door, caked with moorland mud. She hadn't bothered to remove them properly. Mrs. Poole had left a lamp burning in the kitchen. The flame cast dancing shadows across the journals stacked on the table. 4 lifetimes of careful record-keeping, of maintaining her vow, of building walls brick by brick. Elara opened the oldest journal. Her first life handwriting looked young, hopeful. "He called me clingy. I will never speak to him again." 300 years of silence. 300 years of protection she hadn't known she needed. She turned to a blank page at the back of her current journal. The pen felt heavy in her hand. "He broke my heart to save my life. The council would have used me against him. He has watched over me through 4 deaths, 4 rebirths. He avenged me when the Huntress poisoned me." The words looked stark on the page. True, but incomplete. He still let me die alone. He still made that choice for me without asking. The sky outside shifted from black to grey. Dawn crept closer. Footsteps sounded on the path. Too heavy for Mrs. Poole. Elara didn't need to look up when the door opened. "You didn't lock it," Alistair said quietly. "I knew you'd come." She kept writing. "He followed me home. I let him." He moved to the opposite side of the table. His ancient silver eyes tracked her pen across the page. "You're documenting this, like you've documented everything else. 4 lifetimes of records." She closed the journal. "It's how I remember, how I keep myself. You think you'll need to remember this conversation in your next life?" It wasn't a question. Elara met his gaze. "I always die, Alistair. You said so yourself. I keep coming back, and the council keeps watching. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed." He placed something on the table between them. A small glass vial filled with dark liquid. "You know what this is." Her heart stuttered. She did know. 3 centuries of living among immortals, even at a distance, taught certain truths. Vampire blood. Mine specifically, enough to turn you, if you choose. His voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the table's edge. "The council cannot claim a human curiosity who no longer exists. They cannot threaten what they cannot kill." The vial seemed to pulse in the lamplight. Elara's storm-grey eyes fixed on it. "You're offering me immortality. I'm offering you safety. You could stop dying. Stop leaving journals for your next self. Stop being hunted. Stop being human." "Yes." The word hung between them. Elara picked up the vial. The glass felt cool against her palm. Inside, his blood moved like liquid shadow. "What if I say no?" She set it down carefully. "What if I choose to stay mortal, to keep dying and returning, to live exactly as I have been?" Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps. Acceptance. "Then I will continue protecting you, watching from a distance, if that's what you prefer. The council will remain a threat, but I've managed them this long. While I die again and again? While you live as you choose. He straightened. I won't make your decisions for you anymore, Elara. Not even to save you. The sky outside had turned pearl grey. Dawn was coming. Elara stood and walked to the window. The garden she'd tended for 22 years spread before her. Peaceful, solitary, safe. Behind her, Alistair waited. He had waited for 3 centuries. He could wait longer. She thought of her journals. 4 lifetimes of careful documentation, of maintaining herself across death and rebirth, of dying alone while he watched from shadows, of him breaking her heart to save her life. She turned from the window. The vial sat on the table, dark and promising. Alistair's silver eyes held hers, ancient and weary and hopeful. Elara reached for the glass. Her fingers closed around it. Tell me, she said, breaking 300 years of silence with words that mattered. What happens after I drink?